Well, speaking of lightheaded and losing blood, should we go to Chris Colt's Dark Side of the Ring? That seems like a segue if we're ever going to get one. And like I said, we apologize for being a couple weeks behind. This was the previous week, but this one I got a lot of feedback on Twitter. I was a part of it. They weren't just randomly talking to me, but a lot of people enjoyed this more than the average Bear Dark Side of the Ring because they didn't know this story. They didn't know of Chris Colt. They didn't know a lot of the people that were talking heads, which is kind of the point of when I said that, Chris Colt may have been the best wrestler nobody ever saw. You have to listen to this program to have heard many Chris Colt stories, but it was nice. Not only ground that hasn't been trodden here, stampeded to death, trampled is what I'm trying to say, with all the A&E bios, the WWE stuff where they're repeating themselves in a lot of cases now. This was brand new shit, and you don't see Princess Victoria, or it's good to see Billy Anderson, on a program. Tom Burke, one of the great early wrestling collectors and historians, the Global Wrestling News Service. Boy, he ought to give tours of his collection. Talk about a fucking museum. And family members of Colt's, his great nephew and his niece. So it was nice to see new talking heads and except for me. I'm an old head. At least that's what the kids tell me. But they had to lead, Brian, don't you think, with the giant spiders in the cage? Because that way, if you'd never heard of Chris Colt, that was kind of the hook. Even though it was chronologically inaccurate to lead with that, but that was kind of the hook of the, okay, even though we don't know who this fucking guy is, we got to hear more about this.
Do I agree with making that the hook of the piece? Is that
well, yeah, because it came early. It came early on.
I actually thought the episode got better as it got going. And I thought, I personally wouldn't have done it that way. I'll just say that.
Well, that's why I'm saying they had to hook the non-informed viewer on what, and giant spiders climbing a cage is probably,
Hey, listen, if you wanted to hook the viewers, all you had to do was run that promo they had later on in the thing where he's like, I'll fight you and then I'll fuck you.
Yeah. Well, no, he said, I'll fight you, I'll run you out of town, and then I'll fuck you. Well, how's he going to fuck the guy when he's already run him out of town? That's a long distance relationship.
I've got a car.
But it's not mine. And I shouldn't overlook Moondog Moretti was a part of that also. But, and I'm not making a secret of it. I had suggested this story, Chris Colt, this subject to Evan Husney and Jason Eisner a few years ago. I said, boy, if you want to tell a crazy story, Chris Colt, but at that point, the program wasn't established. They didn't want to do that deep of an album cut, but it kept coming back with other people mentioning it. And then they said, well, we can find these people that knew him, and off they went. And as much of this episode was non-wrestling oriented per se, it just about a guy who was noted for being a wrestler, as it was about wrestling. We've talked about there's not a ton of footage of Colt still available. There's plenty of pictures, but some of the footage that's still available they couldn't show. But it was just a story of this fucking guy that was, how would you term Chris? It wasn't that he was crazy. It wasn't that he might have been insane. Clinical definition, but he just got a personality and kind of went with, even though he was multiple gimmicks and multiple characters, it was always
centered around drugs. I think that answers it.
Well, yeah, drugs, but it was something about him. He didn't just say, I'm going to become a fucking garbage man or a plumber. It was all of his gimmicks had some element of one of his personalities in them. And this is one, you can't blame him here for not being chronological, because it's almost impossible. You need a pie chart and like one of those graphics they put up on the screen for the Bloodline dynasty to be able to figure out his lineage and how many different wrestling names he used and gimmick names. And remember at one point there was what was it, an early Inside Wrestling had on the cover a picture of Chris Colt and Ron Dupree as the California Hells Angels and Don Fargo and who was it, Kenny Mack, that the guy that got shot, as the Chain Gang. And will the real Hells Angels please stand up? And then later on, Chris Colt becomes Don Fargo's partner, and they become the Chain Gang and win the. So it was hard to be chronological with this thing to make anybody understand what the fuck was going on.
I think they mostly did a good job with this one, to be honest.
Well, with his early life, especially because a lot of people didn't know anything about, including me, his childhood. He was a wrestling fan when he was a kid, but his parents were apparently violent alcoholics. And, he wants to be a wrestler. He gets on the school wrestling team and bleaches his hair blonde in like 1962 or whatever. So that was frowned upon in that environment. And I knew that he ended up breaking into business in Massachusetts for Tony Santos, but I didn't know that he went to Chicago first and worked as a male hustler to pay his wrestling school tuition there. But Tom Burke had been one of his
clients.
Pals, no, come on now. Don't say, come on, now Tom, he's an older man now, and he might be. God,
I'm joking.
Tom's an older fellow, and he might be offended by that. But no, Tom, again, was one of the early, for lack of a better term, newsletter people where he would send out results, his global wrestling news service, and he had pen pals that sent programs and wrestling results from all over the place. And he had been pen pals with Chuck Harris, who became Chris Colt as a teenager, and he kept saying, I'm gonna get in the business. And then Tom, being from Boston, sees there he shows up, and he's a wrestler, and that's where he met and got involved with Ron Dupree, who was, God, what was the name Ron Dupree was using?
The Golden Boy.
The Golden Boy. But no, was there another actual name he used? So they changed names quite a bit. But anyway, so he
Golden Boy Dupree, I think he's also used.
Well, yeah, but I mean, he Magnificent somebody or other.
No, that was Chris Colt. Chris Colt was Chris Colt. Magnificent Chevalier.
That's right, the Magnificent Chevalier. And Tony Santos, one notch above Jack Pfeffer in the gimmick name category.
Well, that was his booker.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's right, wasn't it?
That was his booker, yeah.
That was his booker at the time. Anyway, so from then on, Ron Dupree and Chris Colt were a couple, and they traveled. They got some early success in Arizona, but they burned the flag on TV out there, and as the story goes, got the promotion kicked off TV. But that's where that magazine cover came from, with the Chris Colt taking a hacksaw to Cowboy Bob Ellis's head. It was the Arizona territory. Bob Ellis had been a big star in all over the Midwest and main evented Chicago, Detroit, and Indianapolis, but he had some kind of financial interest, or they gave him something, or he kept going to Arizona. And it stood out because here was this fucking huge name in this small territory. But that's that famous magazine cover of him taking a hacksaw to Bob Ellis's fucking head. 1972 at the drugstore, you'd walk in and see that kind of shit on the magazine stand.
But that was just so Bob Ellis could explain wearing a wig.
Well, yes, because he sawed off the better part of the front of his. And they told me when I first got into business, I guess it was a fresh thing because the last run that Bob Ellis had was in Puerto Rico, right? And then he was pretty much retired as a wrestler. Very early 80s. Point is, apparently from all those years of being a babyface, getting juice all the time, And I saw it. Ellis had a really bad gig head, right? Not an Abdullah the Butcher style head, but a bad gig head. And they said he had the dermabrasion or whatever it is where they would smooth your head off. And then went to Puerto Rico, the bloodiest territory in fucking wrestling. Anyway.
Hey, can I ask you a quick question? Because I actually heard from Matt Farmer, Wrestling Historian, the other day. He was asking a question, and I didn't know the answer. You mentioned way back in a segment we did about the early days of tape trading that you were getting stuff out of Puerto Rico. What were you getting and when, and who had Puerto Rico stuff other than the commercial tapes?
I'm trying to remember. I didn't get like just regular full television, but I would get matches. And you know what? It may have been somebody that Norman Dooley was trading with, because a lot of times, a lot of the stuff that I got was from him. There was also a guy in Michigan named Marty Slobin that had compilation tapes. You'd have the Georgia TBS show, then a couple of Mid-South matches, then a couple of the Sheik's Detroit things, and some Mid-Atlantic. And who knows? It was fourth generation then. But a lot of that, early stuff, you would get tapes that weren't necessarily from the person who recorded it. So I do not actually know, now that I think about it.
And yeah, that would have been the very end of Cowboy Bob Ellis's career.
In more ways than one. But anyway, I enjoyed in this episode finally knowing, because remember, we've talked about this. What happened? The team of Chris Colt and Mike Boyette. And by the time that they even got to this end of the territory, it was Chris Colt and Bill Dundee, and Mike Boyette made Memphis matches, but never even made live appearances up in this part of the territory. And what was going on there? And they told the story that they got in a fucking fight, that they were riding back from Johnson City, which makes sense because that was at a point in time where, Fuller and the Memphis end and Nick were trading talent. And apparently, Chris Colt freaks out in the back seat and starts punching Bill Anderson, who's driving, his brother Bill Colt, and punching fucking Mike Boyette and pulling his hair in the front seat. And Boyette says, pull a fucking car over. And remember, we've had fun with Mike Boyette talking about the Apocalypse Soldier of Fortune gimmick, and that I managed him in Tennessee when I was first starting and everything. And his brain was kind of fried at that point. But he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was a high-level fucking judo guy. And plus he was, just not somebody you would fuck with. So when they pulled over and Boyette front face locked Chris Colt on the side of the road and fucking put him out, like Hulk Hogan put out Richard Belzer, imagine that, but on the side of the road in East Tennessee at 2:00 in the morning. And then gets back in the car and tells Bill to back up, and then tells him run over him. Then fucking hits puts his foot on the accelerator, and he's got the steering wheel, and Billy Anderson's going out of his mind. He swerves, and they fucking pass him, right? He deserved to die. I can hear Mike Boyette saying that. Sort of more like a stoner, but gruff. And then the next day, Billy goes back to the apartment, and there's Chris Colt somehow. They left him on the side of the road. He's somehow there waiting on him. And he said, we'll get rid of Boyette. And that was the fucking story. And how Bill Dundee inherited that fucking combination. I get Jerry Jarrett wanted to push Dundee at that point. I guess he saw an opening because the only person that prospered out of that thing was Dundee. It kept him going for a few more months till they switched him babyface.
Mike Boyette always looked weird and crazy, but geez, that story, he sounded like a maniac.
Well, this was 1975. By the time I knew him, he was calmer. But that's the thing is...
Remember he had a thing in the UWF, a losing streak. He was on TV every week, like 86, 87, and he had wild hair. He looked nuts.
Yeah. Well, because the last time that I ever saw him, I think I've told this story, it was the the day that we were in San Antonio on Easter Sunday at the Hemisphere for WCW, it was 1990. A fucking idiot they hired to book the arenas had us there. A 17,000 seat building. We had 600 people there, I think. But Mike was living in San Antonio and came up to the back door to visit some of the guys because, you know, everybody from Tennessee knew him. So, but he was covered in mud. It was like he had I can't remember what he was doing, but no, from his head to his toe, he was covered in mud. He was doing some kind of work, digging, or I don't know what the fuck. And and again, you know, it was Mike Boyette. He was very friendly with the guys that he knew, but he looked like something out of a goddamn horror movie. And that's the last time I ever saw him. But no, it was either he was in Vietnam but he was also in judo before he got to service, or he got in judo because he was in the service, but he was pretty good. That's why he came up with the apocalypse gimmick. It was supposed to be a judo martial arts fucking soldier of fortune thing, but then whatever substances he was on, he started painting himself up like the panda bears and all these colors, and they made him get rid of the combat boots because he was kicking guys' fucking heads in. I walked in at time, he's taping his ankles, he's barefoot. I said, what? He said, they made me get rid of my boots. They said they were made out of potatoes. And you know, anyway, it just didn't, he was not all there. But anyway, he was the he was the casualty in that particular, because at least I guess Nick thought, well, I'm keeping the 2 instead of the 1 or whatever. And then finally, because that was Billy Anderson's first run in the business, he was just 18 and he big around as a straw. So they were going to go to Portland or Seattle or somewhere, and in the airport, and Billy just saw Chris at the bar, and before he walked in and said, you know what, fuck it. And he left and went home. And, but he probably would not have goddamn survived.
That was the best movie ever made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He actually, you know, he was not only a wrestler later on, but then referee, ring announcer for the WWF for many years, trainer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so he had a lot better career than Chris did, once he got away from him. Anyway, and then, you know, they jumped around quite a bit, as we said, because how can you keep this straight? But the final few years of Chris's wrestling career, when Ron Dupree died, which was 1975, he had a heart attack. He had become a ring announcer because he'd had a heart attack and had to quit wrestling before. That's why Chris took on, you know, so many other partners. But then
for Dean Silverstone, for Dean Silverstone, right?
For Dean Silverstone, yeah, up in the Northwest. But finally, he had another heart attack and died in the ambulance. So then Chris is out on his own and getting booked from place to place. And they showed the footage because it's out there on YouTube, just a clip. But the Chris Colt experience in 1976, he invented the Rock and Wrestling Connection in front of absolutely nobody in a Canadian indie promotion. It was Superstars of Wrestling for George Cannon.
George Cannon, that's right. Crybaby Cannon.
And that's why Vince had to pay him something for Superstars of Wrestling, because he had trademarked it, didn't he?
That's right. And then I think Vince lost the trademark.
Yeah, but then he came up with so many others. But Colt was using Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper as his entrance music, and as he had the snake, and also that made sense because the Sheik was huge in Michigan and Ontario, and George Cannon was running Ontario in opposition at that point in time. And here he's got his crazy wrestler with a snake, but it added to Chris's aura. But they show the TV clip in the studio. There's 22 people there, and you know, there was nobody there to see it. And then he went to England and they kicked him off television. And that was a shoot. I can't remember what for. And then, he would be some places that I think he was probably in Portland more than any place else between 79 and 82 or 3.
And he wasn't even there that much. It's just
yeah.
He was there a little bit longer than elsewhere, and it was on tape.
Yeah, and they had already told the story in the program of his chance meeting with Janis Joplin in San Francisco, just on the street. Hey, I'll have a drink with you. And he did the same thing, but somehow he aligned himself with Joe Cocker long enough to be a roadie and get on, getting pictures and get on the tour with him for a while. So he was doing shit like that. And by the Southeastern Continental, Chris Von Colt was that 86, 7?
86,
the dying days of that territory too. But he's a Nazi suddenly, Chris Von Colt, because why wouldn't he be? What would be the most offensive thing you could just do? And they mentioned, a lot of the insight came from, as we said, his niece and his grandnephew, because they knew some of the elements of what he was doing when he was away from the wrestling business. And they say he went from cocaine to meth to being addicted to meth. And he was busting crack houses as a fake cop. He'd go in, try to make a buy, then flash a fucking fake badge and take all their shit. What kind of balls does that take? Or lack of possibly critical thinking, or both. I don't know. And then he did the gay porn stuff. They had the director of... Brian, I was conflicted on this guy because he gives his resume. He wrote 20 books. He's a college professor. He's taught literature. He sounded very intelligent. And then they show him with Chris Colt with a headlock on him. He's wearing the GIMP mask in his fucking video that he directed. I was conflicted on whether to take this guy completely seriously as a scholar or not. What'd you think of him?
He seemed, relatively together. Obviously, he was making these films back in the 80s. It was a long time ago. It's almost 40 years ago. And said some interesting things. Hulk Hogan's a gay icon.
Yeah, no, Hulk Hogan was a god to the gay community. I wrote that down. He wanted to do wrestling videos because there was a heavy gay crossover in wrestling fandom. I get maybe that thing, the guy wasn't trolling AJ Styles at one time.
What he said was, I think, wrestling is softcore porn for gay people.
Yes, that's what he said.
What's women's wrestling then?
Well, apparently not very interesting to them either. But nevertheless, so this guy directed these videos and talked about why Chris had a certain level of appeal to the clientele and etc. And that's where Chris was doing the wrestling promos. I'll fight you, I'll run you out of town, and then I'll fuck you. And it's etc. etc. But then they all couldn't even agree on exactly how he died, because we've talked about that was the mystery. Nobody saw him, nobody heard of him. And then his niece said he was found in a back alley in Seattle. Tom Burke said he heard they found him in a chair with a needle in his arm. And the director said he died of AIDS in a flophouse in Seattle, which we believe is the story most often repeated. And I guess the flop house could be located in a back alley. So the niece could be on target with that also. And he was only like 49 years old. So an incredibly gifted guy when it came to understanding the wrestling business, both how to get heat as a heel and how, he loved taking the bumps, and he took the bumps, but the working and the physical aspect of it, he got that. And his shit looked great when he wasn't fucked up and he had, a ring that wasn't cement to work with, sometimes even when he did.
That elbow drop he hits in that clip from George Cannon's promotion. Look at the ring when he hits it. It doesn't move.
Yes, it looks like he drops it on a frying pan. But that's what Johnny Valiant when he was working the early 80s Canadian independence for, I think it was the Bear Man, Dave McKigney. They would book him against Chris Colt, and Colt would say, "Give me all the bumps you can. I love to take bumps. Give me all the bumps you want to give me." And I get there, since it was perfect, because Johnny Valiant didn't really want to take a lot of bumps. But he was talented at that aspect, but he couldn't apply those talents for long or have any reliability placed in him by people in power in any major territory, because you never knew what else was going to happen with Chris Colt and the giant spiders that might climb the cage and try to get him. I never also knew until Billy Anderson did that he got out and started beating the shit out of the entire crowd, and they almost killed him, and Billy Anderson had to fucking save him with a chair.
We always talk about lost footage and things that we wish we could see on video. There's nothing really of note from Arizona.
No, I had gotten 3 or 4 2-inch reels of videotape, so it had to be mid-70s or earlier, from the Arizona territory, a long time ago, from a guy that said, hey, they were in the garage and you might like them. And I finally, through the Dark Side folks, because they were researching this episode, we got them run off, and it was goddamn, what was the guy's name? Ernie Muhammad. Promoter Ernie Muhammad, it was his TV show, and Bob Ellis was on one of the interviews, but otherwise it was like Dale Pierce and a few various local people doing their thing in Arizona in the mid-70s, and nothing of any real note, unfortunately.
All right.
But that was the Chris Colt experience on Dark Side of the Ring.
On the Jim Cornette experience.
On the Jim Cornette experience. See, everybody thinks I ripped off Hendrix. I really ripped off Chris Colt.
So real quick on the topic of Dark Side, obviously we'll get caught up with Chris Adams. We'll probably do that on the Drive-Thru. The Harley race one we also missed.
Oh, golly. And this week is Sherry Martel, and I'm all over that. So we got a lot of catching up to do there, Lucy. But right. Tuesday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern on Vice TV. Get it while it's hot.